The poet Idris Davies's vivid evocation of the South Wales valleys in the 1920s and 30s has pigeonholed him as a voice of a particular time and place. As a challenge to that view, in Forgotten History, Neil Kinnock sets out to show that beyond his community, Davies's verse has a universal message that's relevant to us all. He begins his appraisal in South Wales, the source of Davies's inspiration.
I'm in Rhymney, the hometown of the poet Idris Davies. Surrounded by hills on the edge of the historic county of Monmouthshire, there are people here who can still recall the economic depression that blighted the mining communities of South Wales in the interwar years. And for Idris Davies, Rhymney is the muse that inspired his poetic voice. Idris Davies died at 48 in 1953. It was a life cut short by devastating illness. But for me, his poetry captures perhaps better than anything else the raw ugliness and anger and the contrasting beauty and creativity of industrial Britain, which many of us can recognise.
I've got a picture of them on the staff of Cwmsyddiog School together. We're
sitting in the public library, the hub of Rhymney's community, near to the house in Victoria Street where Idris died. Sian Williams' mother was a teaching colleague of the poet in the 1940s.
Well, my mother was particularly fond of the romantic poets, of Wordsworth and Keats and so on, and that obviously rang a bell with Idris as well. So they used to recite poetry to each other, and she used to say that he was very humorous, that they used to have quite a lot of fun, but didn't think much of his own poetry. He used to say, they're only rhymes. And of course, some of them are very, very simple, but they have a great depth to them, of course.
I grew up near to Rhymney, in Tredegar. But like many others, I didn't know that Idris Davies was from this area until I arrived at university. For me, the impact of his verse is profound, its appeal immediate. So it's surprising and saddening that it's not better known. It's been said that his acuity as an oral historian has obscured his merit as a poet. And perhaps for some people at least, that's true. But in my book, Idris Davies's writing deserves attention. That's why wherever I've been, whoever I've met, and on a very memorable occasion that included Nelson Mandela, I've had a copy of Idris's verse to give them.
Below this old grey bridge there curves a stream, broken in pools and well-nigh dry. Low sounds break o'er its rocky bed, scarce music light of waters. Below, beside the brooklet and touched by lilac blooms, there stands a home, a cottage, creamy-coloured, that nestles in summer trees.
Faber published 3 of his collections of poems. Now, you didn't get away with publishing 3 volumes with Faber without being very good in the 1930s.
Jim Perrin has no doubt of Davies's abilities.
But he is a poet for whom you can feel a personal affection. He does come through. His own character, his own persona comes through very strongly.
When April came to Rhymney, with shower and sun and shower, the green hills and the brown hills could sport some simple flower, and sweet it was to fancy that even the blackest mound was proud of its single daisy, rooted in bitter ground. And old men would remember, and young men would be vain, and the hawthorn by the pithead would blossom in the rain. And the drabbest streets of evening, they had their magic hour, when April came to Rhymney, with shower and sun and shower.
April in Rhymney is one of Idris Davies's best-known poems, and if there's one that keeps him in the anthologies today, this is it. Idris was born in 1905 and evolved as a writer during one of the most troubled periods in the industrial history of Britain. Growing up in Rhymney and working in collieries in Abertysswg and Pontlottyn, he was a first-hand witness to the general strike of 1926, the collapse of the mining industry in the Great Slump, and the years of appalling hardship during the Depression. He documented these experiences in verse.
My fathers in the mining valleys were slaves who bled for beer, who had no saviour to acclaim, and whose God was fear. And they sold the fern and flower and the groves of pine for a hovel and a tankard, and the dregs are mine. So, in these rain-swept graveyards where my fathers sleep, shall I sulk and curse them who made their lives so cheap? Or shall I pause and pity those luckless lads of old, those sullen slaves whipped onward to load my lords with gold?
If there was one set of texts that you had to become acquainted with, it would be the two major sequences, Gwalia Deserta and The Angry Summer. I don't think there's any better representation in verse of how it was for the mining communities in the 1920s and 1930s. It's a very serious political and social analysis, and I don't see that any other Welsh poet of the 20th century has approached that level of gravity and insight into his own society.
Jim Perrin. Indeed, when the great poet T.S. Eliot, managing director of the prestigious firm of Faber and Faber, published Idris, he said that no one has written better of a time and a place. Great praise indeed from a distinguished poet whom Idris respected, even though he, as an avowed socialist, didn't share Eliot's conservative views. But there's a less laudatory interpretation. Professor Daniel Williams of Swansea University.
It's quoted everywhere, of course, and it's kind of a backhanded compliment in that Eliot is the poet of the universal and Idris is the poet of the particular place. But of course, to read Idris Davies today is to realise how universal those themes are.
What Idris did was to use a microcosm to explain the universality. And how somebody as intelligent, but maybe as short-sighted as Eliot, could fail to comprehend the breadth and depth of Idris Davies simply because he nailed the issues so often in Rhymney and the hills around Rhymney and the people of Rhymney. Rhymney was every man, everywhere, in a wretched, angry world.
What will you give me? Sing the sad bells of Romney.
Many people across the world know of Idris Davies through one poem, Pete Seeger's setting of the Bells of Romney. Jim Perrin once again.
It's based on a nursery rhyme, oranges and lemons ring the bells of St. Clement's. I think that set a tone, and I think it's come to be seen as what Idris Davies is about, without seeing what he actually does with that lyric in the context of the sequence.
Who made the mine owner say the black bells of Rhymney?
The Bells of Romney is from Gwalia Deserta, which loosely translates as Wales, a wasteland. It's a long, evocative sequence of 36 poems which follow the events and the aftermath of the 1926 general strike in Davies's community.
So you have the kind of miner everyman Di, who sometimes speaks for himself, sometimes is referred to by a third person, referring to Di. But you also have then the grocer, the preacher, people attending penny concerts. You have the celebration of popular culture. You have jazz, you have music, you have the gazooka bands. You also have the older Welsh culture in the form of the hymns of Pantycelyn. So it's a poem that is about, in a sense, the dynamism of cultural life in a place like Rhymney during a period of bitter economic strife.
I remember the coal tips and the animals around the streets, the pigs chasing after you.
Local historian Marian Evans grew up in Rhymney during the Depression and has illuminated Idris in her writings.
And I remember the people on the strike. My father was in 1935 strike, and I was born that year. But all that sadness still carried on for many, many years. If you couldn't find it or do it, you'd help yourself. And you would either make your own shoes, you'd make your mats. The chapels were a good help, and the churches, they supported everybody and got people together talking, and really got the sense of community together.
This might seem like a somewhat utopian view of a community under threat. Was this kind of sentiment seen elsewhere? Josie Harris, a social historian from Oxford University.
I think identity with Wales by people who move out of Wales is often much stronger than people who move out of local areas in England. I myself was brought up in a small village in southern England, and the identity of that village has now really gone with the wind in a way that I think would be unusual in South Wales valleys.
Even so, Idris Davies wasn't writing in a bubble. He fully engaged with the literature of the period. And nowhere is that more striking than in Gwalia Deserta. Daniel Williams of Swansea University.
Gwalia Deserta evokes T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. It's a kind of wasteland from Wales. And T.S. Eliot was part of a group of writers we call the modernists. Those would be people like Ezra Pound and W.B. Yeats. Now, Idris had some admiration for the work of these people and draws on their work, refers to them. There's one poem where he talks about Twmi Bach crossing the road, where he evokes T.S. Eliot.
Crossing the wasteland behind the damp streets of Aberglow, crossing the wasteland in the October evening, I thought of T.S. Eliot, and then of Ianto Bach Rhys, who had never heard of T.S. Eliot, and I saw the dead thistles bow to the broken tins, and a lonely, bony pony against old Josie's broken fence.
So Idris Davies was a poet of his time, worthy of mention, with Ezra Pound, Spender, T.S. Eliot, representatives at the forefront of literature in the English language. In the 1930s, new avenues were opening up which helped a man like Idris Davies from a small mining community in South Wales to make his mark as a writer.
It's a time when there's quite a marked leap forward in not just basic literacy, but quite well-educated literacy, but before the enormous explosion of the media, which we have now. And bodies like, the BBC, I suppose, could be seen as taking rather seriously a sort of mission to bring serious writing to a wider audience, which helped. It's also a great age of little magazines, which is wonderful for poets. There's an opening up of opportunities for people who are not graduates of ancient universities, but who are literate and imaginative in the way that I think is true of Idris Davies.
Idris Davies gives us his autobiography in poetic form in I Was Born in Rhymney. Leaving school at 14, he faced little alternative but to be a miner. In his writing, he records how he hated crawling and sweating away down in the coalface. It was agony to go down this morning.
A miner's life is like a sailor's.
But he worked underground for 7 years.
Every day his life's in danger. Still
the turning point for the emerging writer took place in 1926. That was the year Idris lost the little finger of his left hand in an accident underground. The unasked-for bonus of that was several weeks off work, which he spent reading Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth and roaming the hills around Rhymney.
There was a dreamer in the mining town who wandered in the evening to the hills to lie among grass and gaze until the day had faded into night. And good it was to breathe the mountain air, the clean, sweet mountain air, and listen to 100 larks make song above the world.
Meanwhile, the miners were at loggerheads with the mine owners over a proposed 13% cut in their wages and an increase in their shifts from 7 to 8 hours a day. But this was the culmination of many years of industrial discontent. Josie Harris, social historian from Oxford University.
The run-up to the general strike is caused by the Depression and by the attempt of employers to reduce wages and the subsequent fairly violent protests in some quarters of South Wales and the locking out of miners who insisted on the right to work.
On the 3rd of May 1926, at 1 minute to midnight, the Trades Union Congress called a general strike. For 9 days, the country ground to a halt. But when the majority returned to work, they left the miners to struggle alone, inspired by the leadership of A.J. Cook, the General Secretary of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain.
Today, up and down our coalfields, miner and his family are faced with sheer starvation. Until he is given adequate compensation, hours of labour that do not make him a mere coal-getting medium, decent living conditions, there can be no peace in the British coalfield.
Idris recorded the events of 1926 in his major sequence, The Angry Summer.
Mrs. Evans-Vach, you want butter again? How will you pay for it now, little woman, with your husband out on strike and full of the fiery language? Aye, I know him. His head is full of fire and brimstone and a lot of palaver about communism. And me, little Dan the grocer, depending so much on the private enterprise. What? Depending on the miners and their money too? Oh yes, in a way, Mrs. Evans. Yes, in a way I do, mind you. Come tomorrow, little woman, and I'll tell you then what I've decided overnight. Go home now and tell that rash red husband of yours that your grocer cannot afford to go on strike. Or what would happen to the butter from Carmarthen? Good day for now, Mrs. Evans-Vach.
The Angry Summer, a poem of 1926. It's full of villages and gardens and humble homes among the broken hills and meeting up with mates and individuals like Lloyd George and the curate and Gladstone and such like. They appear in the story, but it's more than that. Just as Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is about Bedfordshire, as well as being a great spiritual drama, I think this is about Abertysswg and Aberdare and die on his shovel and so on, but it's also an apprehension of a lost civilization.
It had been a desperate, bitter struggle, which left many men facing long-term unemployment as the mines closed down one by one. Idris Davies lost his job in the pits in early 1927. Encouraged by his parents, Idris took correspondence courses and went to night classes and lectures at his local institute.
O young man, alone in the working men's reading room, poring for hours over words and words, delighting in the magic phrase, stirred by the eloquent line.
A high proportion of the young people who were involved in those institutes would have been better read and more well-educated than one might expect from their backgrounds, because the alternative forms of mass entertainment were not so readily available.
Idris completed his teacher training course at Loughborough College in 1932. Marian Evans' father had worked as a miner with Idris, and in the evenings they relaxed at the local institute.
A lot of people used to meet in the institute on Surgery Hill, and of course my father and Idris, they used to play billiards there. A lot of tales about this little house where they used to go and play billiards and talk, all sorts of things.
I don't think one can ignore the presence of organised, radical political forces in the mining valleys, linked to a strong trade union movement and strong Marxian tradition in South Wales. Even before 1914, quite a number of radical young working men managed to get to places like Ruskin College.
This kind of radical thinking was readily embraced by Idris Davies. In 1938, he wrote Dye's Empire, a searing polemic against empire and what it stood for.
Oh, the flags of the empire shine in the breeze, and die endures in the dust, and he crawls and hammers and sweats and blows, and remembers at grub time the washy school building at the turn of the hill, and the empire was bright on the map on moist afternoons in March. There's an anger about the nature of empire and imperialism. But see through the dust the flag of empire flying. The cage is up and Di steps out and picks his dusty shillings from a ledge and trudges home to bread and broth and a cosy evening at the Conservative Working Man's Club, where skittles are red, white and blue.
In a diary entry for November the 5th, 1939, provoked by the opinions of the foremost poets of the left, W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, Cecil Day-Lewis and Louis MacNeice, he set out his own political manifesto and took a sly dig at them too. I am a socialist. That is why I want as much beauty as possible in our everyday lives. And so I'm an enemy of pseudo-poetry and pseudo-art of all kinds. Too many poets of the left, as they call themselves, are badly in need of instruction as to the difference between poetry and propaganda. These people should read Blake on imagination till they show signs of understanding him. Then the air would be clear again, and the land be, if not full of, fit for song. Church and chapel were important institutions in Idris's Wales. There were 12 or more chapels and 3 churches in Rhymney alone. He was a member of several, depending on which of his relatives he was accompanying. Many of Idris's poems make religious references. Some are profound, some laced with irony and very funny, like Capel Calvin. There's a holy, holy people. They are in Capelbach. They don't like surpliced choirs. They don't like Sospenbach. They don't like Sunday concerts or women playing ball. They don't like Williams Parry much or Shakespeare at all. They don't like beer or bishops or pictures without texts. They don't like any other of the non-conformist sects. And when they go to heaven, they won't like that too well, for the music will be sweeter than the music played in hell. In July 1938, when Gwalia Deserta was published, it established Idris Davies as a recognised poet of industrial South Wales. The reviews were mixed, but one in particular stands out from the rest, that of Geoffrey Grigson, the distinguished literary critic. Gwalia Deserta comes out of a simple and superficial mind. It is a series of poems on the dereliction of Wales, indignant but not deep and mannered in the most naive ways. Nothing to bother about.
When Geoffrey Grigson reviews Gwalia Deserta very snootily in New Verse, Idris writes a lacerating letter telling him, well, I was a minor till I was 14. I know what I'm talking about. I could have sounded Dadaist or surrealist if I'd wanted to, but, I'm writing for the people I know. So it's a deliberate aesthetic choice by Idris Davies to write the way he's writing. What Idris Davies does in his poetry is almost he redefines what culture is. In the 1950s, a fellow Gwentian Raymond Williams would claim that culture is ordinary. And in a way, that's precisely the argument that Idris is making in his poetry in the 30s. Culture is what people live.
The searchlights are playing all over the sky, and the young men of Europe are sailing on high, dealing death and destruction to the homes on the plain, and leaving behind them grief, anger, and pain.
Idris had spent much of the war teaching evacuee children in various parts of Britain. In 1947, fed up with his peripatetic life, He returned to the Rhymney Valley to take up a post at Cwmsefeog Junior School, where he was on the staff with Sian Williams's mother. Idris was unjustifiably very self-deprecating about his poetry and deeply dismayed about his capacities in the classroom. Sian Williams.
I don't think he was a poor teacher, but that wasn't what he really wanted to do in his life. I remember her saying that he felt very restricted in school, that, he felt rather closed in a classroom. And although he loved the children, he was very, very happy on the way back from school rather than on the way going there. And when he was in a really good mood, he used to recite the Shropshire Lad.
Yeah.
And in particular, when I was going to Ludlow Fair, I left my necktie God knows where and carried halfway home or near pints and quarts of Ludlow beer.
In 1951, he was diagnosed with abdominal cancer, which led to his death at the age of 48 in 1953.
She was very sad when he was taken ill. I know she went and visited him in hospital in Tredegar and at his home when he was very poorly. And it was a great loss, really.
Self-taught, Idris Davies was a man who pulled himself up by his own literary bootstraps to become an important spokesman for his generation, his class, and his roots in Wales.
Nobody could be more Welsh than Dylan Thomas, and he writes the most famous Welsh poem ever. And he obviously is very Welsh, but I don't think Dylan Thomas self-consciously wrote as a Welshman. He just was a Welshman. Whereas I think Idris does at times write self-consciously as a Welshman.
Idris was certainly a conscious Welshman. His first language was Welsh, his culture in chapel and community was manifestly Welsh, and he shared with many others the rage at being oppressed from outside and above. His brilliance, however, and the quality which makes him timeless, is his understanding of the human condition everywhere and anywhere. And that runs through his writing like a sparkling seam. Come down, young mountain dreamer, to the crowded public square where the anger breaks into music and thrills through the common air, and leave to fade behind you the fantasies you fed from the sentimental sluices of a culture dying and dead. Come down from the mindless mountain and let your daydreams die on the aimless wind that wanders across the friendless sky. And come with your senses quickened and give of the best you can to speed the day that knows anew the dignity of man.
Forgotten History was presented by Neil Kinnock and was produced in Cardiff by Joanna Smith.